For our Shepherd's Bookshelf today, we're going to look at a book called The War of Worldviews and Truth, Lies, and the Battle for the Christian Mind by Dave Jenkins. There are few things, I believe, that are more pertinent for modern Christians today than to have a biblical worldview. We need to examine our worldview. And our worldview is the lens by which we filter and evaluate and process virtually everything we do in life. And if those lenses are cloudy or faulty, then we're going to come away with understandings of the past and the present and the future that is also faulty. In fact, we'll end up with faulty views of God and of ourselves and of our world. So it's very, very important that we have a worldview that reflects what Scripture actually teaches. Sadly, most evangelical Christians lack a biblical worldview, which leaves them susceptible to false teachings, for philosophies that don't line up with Scripture, for theological error, for psychological stumbling, and so forth. Jenkins writes this: only the biblical worldview as revealed in Scripture helps us understand the true narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. It also shapes the way we interpret reality. That's a good overview of the book in many ways. Dave Jenkins is the executive director of the Servants of Grace Ministries and the executive editor of Theology for Life magazine. He defines a worldview as the framework of beliefs by which a person views the world around them, the guide or filter by which they view their world. For Christians, this filter is the Bible, and that's absolutely correct, I believe. In his book, he says the goal of writing this book, and the reason he wrote it, is to help the average Christian understand more clearly what a biblical worldview is and how it is under attack, and thus enabling them to stand for a biblical worldview. So he's not going after the scholars per se here, although there's much material here that would be helpful to anybody, but he wants to write so that the average Christian person can have a good handle on what a worldview is and what a biblical worldview is, and to have a good clarity on that. Now, according to the statistics he gives here, 51% of American adults claim to have a biblical worldview. But when research is done by people like Barna, I think we're closer to 6 or 7% of Christians, evangelical Christians, who actually have a biblical worldview. And that's based upon some worldview kind of questions, theological questions, that Barna and different pollsters use that I would consider pretty minimalistic. Therefore, you can have a supposed biblical worldview and miss out on a whole lot of things that are essential in biblical theology and understanding of the Christian life. Not just partial, but essential. And so I think that's very important that we understand that, quite frankly, probably far less than 6% of evangelical Christians, we're not talking about people that claim to be born again, but of evangelical Christians could really be identified as those of the biblical worldview. So there's a real crisis out there, because if Christians don't understand what it is to see the world through God's lens of Scripture, if they don't understand that and don't understand the Scriptures and theology well enough to be able to process that, then we're in trouble. And no wonder we have so many different isms and cults and so forth going around today that are not drawn from Scripture and does not emerge from Scripture. So this is important. It's a good book to write. This is a book, I think, it's not very long. There's 130 or so pages, plus about 20 pages on the introduction of this book. So 160 pages or so. Very readable, very accessible. And Jenkins is going to discuss the effects of other worldviews as distinguished from a biblical worldview, what those effects have on our thinking and our living today. And so he hits a lot of topics that you might not think are worldview issues at first, but they certainly are. So here are some of the topics. For example, his first chapter is devoted to the understanding of creation and God's creation of the world as opposed to the secular ideas of evolution and various things about creation. Chapter 2 is devoted to salvation and the importance of understanding what salvation is about and what God has saved us from. Believe it or not, there are a lot of people that claim to be Christians that they don't have a handle on salvation and justification and so forth. Chapter 3 is all about the authority of Scripture. This is very pertinent to our discussion here because if you have other authorities that are challenging the Scriptures for dominance in our lives, then our worldview is not going to be very biblical. It's going to be a hodgepodge. And I think that's probably where most Christians are today. They do believe in the Bible, and they do read the Bible, and they do have some theological standards and understandings, but they mix that and match that with views, secular views in the worlds all around us, psychological views, philosophical views, just views that they pick up in the popular world, and they put that together in their own cafeteria style of theology and understanding of the world that is very problematic. So having an understanding of the authority of Scripture, the Scripture trumps all things, and rules over all other views and philosophies, and all the views and philosophies have to be examined through a biblical lens of worldview. The next chapter is concerning discernment. Of course, that kind of goes along with these other things. A discernment of this world, this life, and other views and philosophy. A discernment in the reading of books and listening to sermons and podcasts. Are these things truly biblically oriented or not? The next chapter is about truth and deconstruction. So biblical truth that comes, of course, from the Bible, but then this issue of deconstructionism, postmodernism, and so forth, that is a challenging truth. The biblical worldview teaches that truth comes from the Bible. Other views by some Christians would be a view where we are adding other things, that we're deconstructing the Bible. We're believing that our truth is good enough, even though it's not biblical truth. My truth is my truth, and that's good for me. That's probably the standard view of most people today who claim to be Christians, but it's not a biblical worldview. And then there's worship. Does our worldview have a play and a standard for us on how we are to worship God, and corporately and privately? It certainly does. Then there's spiritual confusion as he works on the next chapter related to the New Age movement, things like the Enneagram and the Jesus Calling type books that have become so popular today that really many people turn to rather than Scripture. Then there is science and scientism. So he is certainly not opposed to true science, as that research that's done into how people live and things we can measure and so forth. But there's a difference between that and scientism that trumps true science and true biblical understanding. And then he spends a great deal of time on communism, Marxism, and humanism. These are things that, of course, have really infiltrated, especially the younger generations today who've gone to colleges and universities that are teaching Marxism and humanism as opposed to Christianity, true Christianity. So he devotes chapter 10 to that, and I think he does a very fine job in explaining all of that. So the War of Worldviews not only warns of the dangers and the philosophies that are not derived from Scripture, but also details and explains what a biblical worldview is and how transforming our thinking and in turn our lives it should be. It is the means by which truth and reality can be discerned in the midst of a dark and confusing culture. In writing this book, I believe Jenkins has done a real service to all of us, to remind us again of the importance of a biblical worldview, to identify what it is, to challenge those philosophies that are not biblically oriented, and to write especially for those that are the normal Christian, the average Christian, not the scholar, not the theologian, but just the average Christian that needs a good handle on a biblical worldview and the encouragement to develop one in their life. So I appreciated this book quite a bit, and I hope that you would choose to read it. And also, I think it'd be a really good book for a small group Bible study to work out a worldview in that kind of context. Recommend it highly.